Welcome to today's deep dive. Why is a plant that is globally notorious for spreading like an uncontrollable weed suddenly, the absolute hardest thing in the world to keep alive?
It's the ultimate gardening irony, honestly.
It totally is. And if you've ever stared at a wilting houseplant, just wondering how something so green and vibrant could just decide to give up on your watch, especially when you did everything the little plastic tag told you to do well,
Yeah.
you are in exactly the right place.
Yeah, we've all been there with that plastic tag.
Right. It's infuriating. But our mission today is to unpack a single, highly relatable dispatch from the front lines of everyday gardening. We are looking at a really fascinating blog post. It's titled Notes on Gardening, Part 872, The Peppermint Puzzle.
Yeah, and it was written by an author named Ang, published on April 20, 2026. And, the title alone is a massive clue about what we're dealing with today.
Oh, absolutely.
Because Part 872 tells you immediately that this isn't some, glossy, perfectly staged gardening magazine tutorial.
No, not at all.
Right. This is an active, ongoing scientific log. It's the raw documentation of someone who has been observing, hypothesizing, failing, and just trying again for a very long time.
871 previous notes.
Ah.
I mean, that is serious dedication to the dirt.
It really is.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to jump right into the core contradiction that sparked Ang's post. Ang writes about trying to propagate peppermint. The botanical name is Mentha x piperita for, quote, many moons.
Many moons. A long time.
Right, and despite trying for all these moons, Ang admits to having incredibly limited success. And I have to say, this drives me crazy on a personal level.
Oh, why is that?
Because trying to grow a famously invasive weed and failing, well, it's like failing an open book test where the teacher explicitly gives you the answer key in advance.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It just feels uniquely embarrassing. But, I refuse to believe this is just Ang's fault. Calling a plant easy or labeling it hardy feels like a total trap.
A trap for the consumer, you mean?
Yeah. It's like dropping a polar bear in the middle of the Sahara Desert and calling the bear weak when it faints. I mean, it's not a weak bear.
Right. It's just a terrible context for a bear.
Exactly.
What's fascinating here is that the polar bear analogy actually perfectly illustrates the psychological blind spot we create with these botanical labels.
Yeah.
The concept of hardiness is entirely relative.
Completely relative.
Yeah, we casually slap the label weed onto peppermint because of how it behaves in its native or, ideal environments.
And what does that ideal environment actually look like for peppermint?
Well, peppermint is actually a natural hybrid of watermint and spearmint. So it evolved to thrive in temperate zones, usually near streams, right? In cool, moist, really rich soil.
Okay, cool and moist.
Right. And when it finds those specific conditions, it utilizes these underground stems called rhizomes.
Rhizomes.
Yeah, these rhizomes shoot out horizontally just under the surface of the soil, basically sending up new clones of the parent plant everywhere they go. It's this relentless lateral takeover strategy.
So when we call it a weed, we aren't describing some magical, indestructible property of the plant itself. We are just describing a biological mechanism.
Exactly.
Those spreading rhizomes, they only kick into high gear when the soil temperature and the moisture levels basically give it permission to do so.
Yeah, we assume the hardiness is like this innate force field.
Yeah.
But it is actually an interaction between the plant's genetics and a very specific set of environmental data.
Which we completely ignore when we buy it.
Totally. When you buy a pot of peppermint at the store, the label just says, grows like a weed. It sets up this total illusion of control. And Ang's post captures this frustration brilliantly.
It really does.
The text explicitly calls out the irony of a hardy plant failing to thrive. The expectation was this zero-effort victory. But reality forces us to, abandon the label and actually look at the physical needs of the living subject right in front of us.
Right, because if the label hardy is just an illusion based on temperate climates, then the real variable we have to examine is the battlefield itself.
The battlefield, I like that.
Well, let's look at where Ang is actually forcing this plant to live. The dispatch tells us the setting is a front balcony in a tropical climate.
Tropical climate, yeah.
That's a huge shift, a massive shift. Ang explicitly notes that the, quote, tropical weather can be rather unforgiving. And then we get this wonderfully humble admission about the human element, which I just love.
Oh, the watering comment.
Yes. Ang confesses to a gardening style that, quote, without adequate watering sometimes might be contributing to the issue.
It takes courage to admit that in a gardening log.
It really does. But it made me wonder, How much of this failure is just user error, and how much is a genuine environmental mismatch? Like, can you ever really outwater a fundamentally unforgiving tropical sun?
That is the million-dollar question. And to understand why that combination of tropical sun and inconsistent watering is so lethal, we have to break down the physics of a tropical balcony.
Okay, let's get into the physics.
It completely redefines the rules of engagement for a plant that, like we said, evolved to grow near cool streams. Think of a peppermint plant growing natively in the ground.
Okay, so in the earth.
Right. The earth basically acts as a massive thermal battery. It absorbs the sun's heat very slowly during the day and then disperses it at night.
So it stays pretty stable.
Exactly. Deep down where the rhizomes are spreading, the soil stays relatively cool and insulated. Plus, moisture is constantly drawn up from the water table deep underground through capillary action.
So the ground is basically a self-regulating, incredibly stable system.
Spot on. It's doing a lot of the work for you.
But Eng's plant isn't in the ground. It's in a pot on a balcony.
Yeah.
And a terracotta or plastic pot sitting on a concrete slab isn't a thermal battery at all. It's an oven.
It is literally an oven. It's a severely restricted volume of soil suspended in midair. The physical dynamics are entirely different than the forest floor.
Because of the concrete.
Because of everything, really. The tropical sun blasts the pot from the top. Then, the concrete balcony absorbs that intense solar radiation and acts like a radiator, baking the pot from the bottom.
Oh, wow.
And then the ambient tropical air heats it from all sides. It is a 360-degree heat assault. And because the soil volume is so small and it's exposed on all sides, moisture evaporates out of that pot at an exponential rate compared to being in the ground.
Which brings us directly back to the human holding the watering can.
Yep.
Eng admits to a gardening style that occasionally lacks adequate watering. And when I read that, I genuinely wondered where you draw the line between a forgetful human and just an impossible environment.
It's hard to say.
Right. Like in a microclimate like a tropical balcony oven, is it even physically possible to outwater the sun? If you miss a watering cycle by just 12 hours, that restricted volume of soil is completely baked.
Honestly, the line between human error and environmental hostility doesn't even exist here. They just amplify each other.
They feed off each other.
Exactly. Gardening is a constant dynamic interaction between the organism, the microclimate, and the human caretaker. The sheer harshness of the tropical balcony demands absolute, almost robotic consistency from the human just to buffer the heat.
Right, because you are fighting the environment.
You're doing the environment's job. The human caretaker essentially has to artificially recreate the moisture levels of a cool, temperate stream bank on a baking concrete slab every single day.
Wow, when you put it like that, it sounds exhausting.
It is. So when human fallibility, just getting busy with life and missing a watering meets an unforgiving physical environment, the plant's so-called hardiness collapses instantly.
So it's a cascading failure. The peppermint isn't weak, and Eng isn't a uniquely terrible gardener.
Not at all.
It's the combination. This specific temperate rhizome system confined to a tiny pot on an elevated tropical balcony, relying on a human who occasionally forgets a watering cycle. I mean, that is a fundamentally hostile ecosystem.
It really is. The physics of the balcony are working against the biologies of the plant 24/7. We often forget that plants are incredibly sensitive environmental sensors. They read the data of their surroundings constantly. And the balcony is giving the peppermint data that tells it to shut down, not spread.
So knowing that the balcony is a hostile ecosystem, we arrive at the actual physical evidence Eng observes on this newest batch of peppermint.
The symptoms.
Yes. The deep dive transitions here into what I can only describe as a botanical whodunit. Eng's newest plants are showing a primary symptom. The leaves are starting to turn brown.
Which is super common, but also really vague.
Very vague. And this is where the documentation of Part 872 becomes so crucial. Eng lays out 3 suspects for what is killing the plant, and these aren't just random guesses.
No, they're based on experience.
Exactly. Suspect number 1 is heat stress. Suspect number 2 is root rot. Eng notes these are the primary theories based specifically on past data from growing plants on this exact front balcony.
Right.
And then we have suspect number 3, the outlier. Pests, specifically spider mites.
Eng's approach here is highly systematic. By referencing that historical balcony data, they are using probabilistic reasoning to really narrow down the field of suspects.
And here's where it gets really interesting to me. If you look at Eng's 2 primary suspects, heat stress and root rot, they present a brilliant, mind-bending contradiction.
They really do.
Think about the mechanics. Heat stress implies the plant is baking dry. It means there is too much unforgiving tropical sun and too little water from the caretaker. The plant is literally burning up.
Right, it needs water desperately.
But root rot implies the exact opposite extreme. Root rot means there is too much water, poor drainage, the plant is practically sitting in a swamp.
Yeah.
So how can Aang be trapped between two polar opposite causes that produce the exact same brown leaves? It feels like whether Aang picks up the watering can or leaves it alone, the visual result is identical.
It's so frustrating for gardeners. But we have to look at the hidden biological mechanisms to understand why those endpoints look identical.
Okay, take us underground.
All right, so to the human eye, a brown leaf just registers as dry.
Yeah.
But let's look under the soil. When you overwater a potted plant, especially if the pot lacks perfect drainage or the soil is too dense, the dirt becomes completely saturated.
Like a sponge that can't hold anymore.
Exactly. All the tiny microscopic air pockets between the soil particles just fill up with water. And here's the thing people forget. Roots don't just drink water. They actually need to breathe oxygen to function.
Wait, roots need to breathe.
They do. In waterlogged anaerobic soil, the roots literally suffocate.
They drown in the pot.
They drown. And once they suffocate and die, opportunistic fungal pathogens that thrive in wet anaerobic conditions attack that decaying root tissue.
Oh, gross.
Yeah, that is the rot. Now here is the crucial mechanism. Once the root system is destroyed by rot, the plumbing of the plant is entirely compromised. It can no longer absorb water from the soil and pump it up the stems to the leaves.
Oh, wow. So even though the plant is sitting in a swamp of completely saturated soil, the leaves are entirely cut off from the water supply. The leaves are literally dying of thirst while sitting in water.
The biological mechanism of the symptom is identical. A lack of moisture reaching the leaf tissue causes the plant cells to collapse, dry out, and turn brown.
That blows my mind.
Right. Heat stress causes this dehydration through rapid evaporation from the sun. Root rot causes it by destroying the internal delivery system. The visible symptom of drowning is dehydration.
Man, this is why diagnosing plant problems is so incredibly maddening for everyday gardeners. You see a brown, crispy leaf, your brain screams it needs water, you soak the pot, and you end up accelerating the fungal rot that was killing it in the first place.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle.
That is a massive aha moment. So Aang is standing on this balcony, looking at brown leaves, trying to figure out if they underwatered and fried the plant in the tropical sun, or if they overcompensated, drowned the roots, and effectively starved the leaves of water anyway.
It's a tightrope walk over a volcano.
It really is. And this makes Aang's probabilistic deduction so impressive to me. Knowing the balcony's history, knowing the extremes of the tropical environment, and knowing their own inconsistent watering habits, Aang deduces that environmental extremes, like the heat or the overwatering, are vastly more likely to be the culprit than a sudden external invasion of bugs.
Yeah, in any closed system, whether it's, a piece of software or a potted plant on a balcony, human error or environmental extremity is usually the simplest and most mathematically probable explanation.
Makes sense.
The human caretaker is almost always both the lead detective and the prime suspect.
I love that, the lead detective and the prime suspect. But Aang doesn't stop there. Even though the environment is the most likely culprit, Aang remains open to suspect number 3.
The spider mites.
Right. The dispatch mentions planning to investigate the plant in detail, specifically checking the underside of the leaves for spider mites.
Which is hard because spider mites are these microscopic arachnids that actually thrive in hot, dry environments, like a tropical balcony.
Oh, really? So they would love that balcony.
They'd be having a party out there. They congregate on the underside of leaves and basically pierce the plant cells to suck out the sap.
Ugh, nasty.
Yeah, and over time, this localized cellular damage causes the leaves to stipple, turn yellow, and eventually turn brown and die.
So it's another path to the exact same brown leaf.
Exactly. It's a completely different mechanism of destruction compared to the systemic plumbing failure of root rot. But from 3 feet away, it just looks like a failing plant.
But Aang knows to look closer.
Right. By physically flipping the leaves over to check for the mites, Aang completely avoids diagnostic tunnel vision. You test the most probable hypothesis based on your historical data, but you don't ignore the less likely variables. You verify everything.
You have to. So what does this all mean for you listening right now?
I think the ultimate takeaway from Aang's Peppermint puzzle is that generic one-size-fits-all advice is practically useless in the real world.
Oh, absolutely useless. Someone casually telling you, oh, just buy a peppermint plant. It grows like a weed, is completely ignoring the specific, unforgiving microclimates we actually live in and our own very real human habits.
Yeah, it ignores the physics of your balcony.
And the humidity of your living room and the reality of your busy schedule.
Context dictates survival. The label hardy is not some magic spell a plant casts to protect itself. It is simply a description of how a plant behaves when all its invisible requirements are perfectly met.
Well said.
And I should note for you, the listener, that the investigation on Ang's balcony is actually still ongoing. The dispatch ends with Ang promising to check those leaves and continue observing in the coming days. The scientific method is alive and well in the tropics.
The trial and error of Part 872 continues.
It never ends.
And that leaves me with a final thought I want you to carry with you today. We spent this time looking at how a supposedly stubborn, invasive weed actually requires an incredibly precise alignment of environmental variables just to survive outside of its native zone.
It's surprisingly fragile.
Right. The soil temperature, the root oxygen levels, the human watering schedule, all of it has to perfectly balance just to keep a few leaves green. So, here is my question for you. If even a famously aggressive weed demands perfectly aligned conditions to thrive, what does that say about our own human attempts to seamlessly adapt?
Oh, that's a great point.
Because we constantly force ourselves into environments we weren't natively designed for, whether it's white-knuckling your way through a high-pressure, incredibly stressful new workplace, or trying to put down roots in a completely different city with an unforgiving culture. Are we unfairly labeling ourselves as failing when really we're just experiencing the human equivalent of the peppermint puzzle?
Just a bad microclimate.
Exactly. Something to think about. Until next time, keep investigating your own microclimates.